The Parkinson's podcast is brought to you by the Davis Phinney Foundation and brings you the stories, wisdom, and expertise of people living with Parkinson's, care partners, and Parkinson's professionals. In this episode, Mark Stacy, MD, and Peter Schmidt, PhD, discuss participation in clinical trials for Parkinson's.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Chris Kruger, and I'm the Program Manager for Educational Content with the Davis Phinney Foundation. And I'm here with Dr. Peter Schmidt and Dr. Mark Stacy to talk about clinical trials for people with Parkinson's. As a person with Parkinson's, I've been interested in many trials, and I've chosen to participate in some of them and not to participate in others for just personal reasons. And I'm really excited for our conversation today. So to start off, maybe each of you can just introduce yourselves. Mark, why don't you start?
I'm glad to be here, and it's good to be able to have these conversations, particularly when everybody's scattered across the country. My career is kind of scattered across the country. I started at the University of Missouri in '91, then went to Phoenix and started the Muhammad Ali Parkinson Research Center. In 2003, I went to Duke University and was there till 2017. Pete and I worked together to run the medical school at East Carolina University from 2017 to 2021. And now I'm at the Medical University of South Carolina, where I'm seeing Parkinson's disease patients again.
Very good. Thank you, Mark. And Pete, can you tell us a little bit about your background? I mean, we just heard a little bit that there's a partnership at work here, but give us a little more background about you, Pete, please.
Yeah, so I'm Pete Schmidt. I have a PhD in applied math, and I have done a ton of different things. I started out working primarily in simulation of clinical trials, and then I wound up getting engaged in actual clinical work, and went to the National Parkinson Foundation back when that was a separate entity in 2009, and led the programs there until 2017 when I joined Mark at the Brody School of Medicine. And when we, after leaving there, I joined a CRO, a contract research organization that does the operations of clinical trials for pharma and for NIH. And my main focus is NIH trials. I'm the PI on a U01 running clinical trials in immunology. And we'll get to immunology is an interesting new way we're thinking about the brain. There's a lot of immunology now in the brain, but I also go back and do clinical trials. I'm a neuroscience advisor on clinical trials that we're doing in the commercial space. And my title here is Chief Scientific Officer. I'm also a board member of the Davis Phinney Foundation. I think the work you guys do is amazing, and I am fully committed to supporting the Phinney Foundation and your mission.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for your time today and your time throughout the previous work we've done together, both of you. So maybe to start off our conversation about clinical trials today, it would be great if we could just kind of get an overview.
Our clinical trials have been focused in kind of three major areas. One would be to try to slow the progression of Parkinson's disease. The other would be to try to treat the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And the third one would be more neurosurgical, to try to look at better surgical interventions and more effective ways to treat Parkinson's disease when medications are not enough. And so if you look at the pipeline at any time, you will see trials that are looking at those three different areas, as well as increasing areas interested in genetics as we become closer to defining more homogeneous Parkinson's disease populations rather than the heterogeneous Parkinson's patients that we enroll in typical trials. Pete, your turn.
So I think that this is now a really exciting time in trials. For a long time, for a long time, we were very limited in our vision. If you look at how people thought about the brain just a decade ago, we really thought about the brain as being neurons that form a network, and the way they communicate across synapses, the sort of standard brain functioning. And we thought that the pathways to addressing Parkinson's disease would be about supplementing neurotransmitters, putting more of the stuff into the brain that sends a signal from one neuron to another, surgically rewiring the brain, taking out sections of the brain or modulating sections of the brain that we felt were malfunctioning, or sticking more neurons into the brain, the cell-based therapies. And none of those seemed, there was a breakthrough, an absolute breakthrough, the kind of thing that you don't see anywhere in medicine in 1975 when they approved Sinemet. Absolutely tremendous. I had a friend who was a pharmacist, and he was telling me that they would talk about, he was active in pharmacy at the time in 1975, and he would talk about how this was amazing to people, how much of a difference the introduction of Sinemet made when there was no effective treatment. But since then, things have been, we've kind of pursued those same avenues and have had gradual progress. There have been some incremental benefits. Today, we've gone back and the advances in neuroscience have introduced all sorts of new ways that we can try to address Parkinson's disease. All sorts of things that seem to work on the lab bench or in an animal model. And we really need to understand, are those things that are going to change the experience for people? So why do we need patients to participate in clinical trials? Is that there's so many things that on the whiteboard or in a cell, in a petri dish, look amazing. But you can't approve a drug on that basis. We need to know if it improves a patient's life. When it comes down to it, for all that we can say that we can modify how aspects of a cell work, or a cell in a dish work, or even aspects of how the brain works, if it doesn't give you a better life, it's not worth putting into the healthcare system. It's not worth people paying exorbitant amounts to get access to something that changes chemistry but not experience. And so that's why we desperately need people to get involved, especially in some of these novel approaches, these things where we're looking at how neurons, how the metabolic cycle of neurons work, or how the helper cells in the brain, there are cells called glia and astrocytes, and people are thinking about how those can affect Parkinson's disease. And we can show that we can make a difference in a cell in a dish, or sometimes we make little things called organoids that are clumps of human neurons and cells that float in a solution of sugar water, and we can show that we can modify how those things behave, but it doesn't mean it changes somebody's life. So that's what the sequence of clinical trials is about. Can we show that it's safe to give somebody something? Can we show that it's actually doing something? And then can we show that we can reliably give somebody relief from symptoms, hopefully something permanent, slowing the progression of a disease, so that can then become part of clinical practice.
And I'm interested in looking a little bit what do people that have that are living with Parkinson's, what should we be thinking about as we look at clinical trials? What do we need to know? I mean, things like what are the safety protocol that are put in place before a trial is approved to start, and what risks are there? What about stages of trial? There are early stages and phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So can you just give a detailed sort of overview of what things we might need to know as we think about participating in a clinical trial, just so we can lay the land for everyone?
So Pete, why don't you take the phasing, and then I'll talk about what I think a patient should think about on that scaffold.
So it's very hard to guess what is going to work and what's not going to work. I've heard people come in with ideas that I thought were crazy, and they've run a trial and they've gotten something really positive out of it. So there are very strong regulations that I spend a lot of my time thinking about for protecting the safety of people who participate in trials. The staging of trials, the first thing we do is phase 1. And phase 1 is really where we take as small a group as we can reasonably use and say, is this drug safe to run trials in humans with? So we're really not looking for you. The first part of, I'm working on a phase 1 trial now, where the first part, we just get people who are healthy and they will try a drug and we'll see how it affects them. We'll try it at different doses to see how different doses affect them. Then you get to what's called a phase 1B, where you get people who have the condition you're hoping to treat. And again, what you're really looking at is it's a safety-focused trial. We have a strong safety team. And for a trial like that, what I look for is a physician who has an understanding, who's worked a lot in diverse clinical trials, who can see, who will recognize side effects, recognize a pattern of side effects. So we're super careful in phase 1 and phase 1B trials. When you get to phase 2, that's where we say, okay, Dr. Stacy, you come up with this idea. Can you show us it works when you do it? So phase 2s are usually fairly small studies run at centers that will put in some time to understand what they're supposed to be doing. And we say, does this thing show a sign that it really works? Can we really understand that it works? And can we get out of this a signal showing us that this is giving patients a benefit? And what dose should we be using? So these days, clinical trials are really expensive. So when you get to phase 3 is technically where you prove it works. But you really want to know that the drug works before you get to phase 3, or else you're going to spend a lot of money and not get anything from it. So when we get to phase 3, what we're really testing is, this works in Dr. Stacy's clinic. Does it work when everybody does it according to a set of instructions that we give them about how to use this?
The way I look at patients for clinical trials is every patient has a level of interest in clinical trials, and that interest changes, I think, with in early disease and then with disease progression. Phase 2 is a trial that I'm more cautious about because, as Pete said, we don't really know the full safety profile in that area. Phase 3 is one that I'm always going to be much more encouraging for patients because we really kind of think the drug works then. But the population that I'm really trying to talk to about entering medical clinical trials are in very early Parkinson's disease. We have a neuroprotective agent. And then in patients for symptomatic therapy when we run out of really good options. But I don't think in patients with symptoms of Parkinson's disease, you should skip the proven drugs that work to go look at drugs that aren't proven. And it's just my philosophy that physicians' jobs are to keep people with Parkinson's disease as mobile as possible for as long as possible. And if you skip the medicines we know they're going to make them mobile to test something, that's just something I don't think is the right thing to do.
Yeah, so just to zero in on that for a second, I think what you're talking about is a trial that might preclude a participant because they're taking levodopa or a dopamine agonist. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that one thing to think about is if you are limited in your physical ability or your movement abilities, and to participate in a trial, you would have to withhold that medication or not take a medication that can help. That's something to think very seriously about, and maybe it's not advisable.
Agreed. And if I had anything that I would do to change neuroprotective trials, I would try to figure out where you could have an independent monitoring to say, okay, you have participated in this trial as long as possible, but your mobility is really impaired. And maybe your doctor has not noticed your mobility is really impaired because it's so gradual. Or maybe you have not noticed your mobility is so impaired because it's so gradual. But when I look at your numbers here and your numbers here, you've had a marked change and you need to go on therapy so your life is better.
And I'll say, I'm working on a trial now where we're recruiting participants who have not yet started medication, and we've been very careful to write the protocol so that you are allowed to start medication without withdrawing. It makes the study harder to execute, and the numbers are harder to analyze. But we don't want to have patients not take medication when it will benefit them. And just to give you an idea, there's another study I'm working on that is about measuring Parkinson's disease. It's an observational study, a new approach to measuring Parkinson's disease. And I was on a call with them and I said, right now, the holy grail of measurement is something that you can read through initiation of medication. That if you're recording something before the patient's on medication, and then when they start medication, you can still track their progression through that. We really don't have good ways to do that in a clinical trial.
I wonder if you both might say a little more about what you think that a participant might get from a clinical trial. What benefits might they receive?
So at one point, I had lunch with the chief scientist for PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and he was saying that if he got sick, his ideal treatment path would be to be randomized to the placebo arm of a clinical trial, because if you're in the placebo arm, you're going to have a leading expert give you the best care they possibly can, plus a sugar pill. And so you don't have the risks of the drug, and you get the benefit of the best care you possibly can.
Yeah, that's really a spin on the way people often think about this, right?
Yeah.
I speak from my own experience. I was thinking, oh boy, I don't know that I want to get the placebo. But on the other hand, if you can contribute, you can get attention from people, and you don't have the risk. So that's an interesting spin. I like that.
So if you go to see Mark and Mark doesn't know what you're getting, so I'm a mathematician. So when we look across a whole bunch of people participating in trials, they'll all differ a little bit, and that creates noise in the data. And we average across people to figure out which is better, the active intervention or the placebo, and our hope is the active intervention is better. But if you want to have the least noise in a study, you have to give everyone the absolute best treatment, because all well-treated people are similar and every poorly treated patient is different, to paraphrase Tolstoy. So you wind up with your data is terrible if people are not getting great treatment. And so so they have so everybody involved in a trial has an interest in making sure that every participant gets the best possible management.
And so, as you all know, access to a physician is sometimes difficult. But if you've participated in a clinical research trial and you know the coordinators in that clinical research trial, you know other personnel, and you know that we want you to do well. And you also know we believe we owe you something. And while that's very quid pro quo, it is what happens. We get to know you better. When you can't reach a physician, you can call that coordinator, and that coordinator will get that physician in a hurry. And so you'll have access to more urgent responses. I think you also will gain a lot of access to just information and an ability to think about, okay, what about me? And just hanging out matters. And you get to see some other people with similar interests and similar motivations to get better. And so I think the overall benefit is beneficial to your mood and to your overall sense of I'm a little more empowered because I participated in this clinical trial, because I understand my disease better, I understand the medications better, and I understand how I can reach out to this study team for urgent matters. And so you feel a little bit more in control.
So, and we just did I was just reviewing yesterday a new training. We're putting a new version of our training on good clinical practice, the sort of standard for how you conduct a trial. And the message that is very clear in all of these documents is that the benefit, that the goal is to benefit the participant, and harm to the participant will not justify benefit to society. We have to be focused on trial participants first. And if we can help, we cannot do it. If we identify that there is a risk that's manifesting from participating in a trial, we have to address that risk as soon as we see it, and not continue and not risk exacerbating. So if you have a mild side effect or a reaction to a drug, we can't just keep giving you that drug because we think that more data will provide more benefit to society. We need to focus on the participants first.
I'm wondering if you have any other pieces of advice, if either of you had any pieces of advice for someone who is thinking about clinical trial participation and they want to, be able to evaluate whether this trial is designed well, or if there's anything that is particularly relevant that somebody might want to think about in that regard. How can they know if a trial is well conceived?
So a good clinical trial has several components. One is actually an informational informed consent process in which you can understand what's going to happen and you are able to talk with people freely and openly about that consent process. If somebody sits down and says, sign this and you can participate, that's not informed consent, and I would not advise signing that. The next thing to think about is how are you randomized to a treatment or placebo arm? And how is that done? And how does that, and then how do they maintain a blind? And so if you have a team that talks about whether you're on study drug or not, a lot, that does not maintain a blind very well, even though you may not know that information. The next is independent assessment. And is it the neurologist or the coordinator that's going to do the assessments, or is it going to be another person doing independent assessment? And if you have a good informed consent, you have randomization you can believe, and you have independent assessment, then I think you have a clinical trial that will stand the test of review for results publication. But without those, as a reviewer for Movement Disorders Journal, those are the pieces I really pick apart when I'm considering whether a manuscript should be published in the journal.
So a couple of red flags. What are the red flags to look for in a trial? A trial should be listed in clinicaltrials.gov. If somebody talks to you about participating in research and that research is not listed in clinicaltrials.gov, run away. The team should engage you in the informed consent. They should talk to you. They should give you an opportunity to ask questions. You should understand it. You should have a family member with you. If you're worried at all about your ability to understand it, and have somebody go through it with you and say, what are the risks and what are the potential benefits? If your neurologist invented something, there need to be independent people involved in the trial. You need to make sure that it's not, I invented this, I'm having a trial of it, and I'll determine whether it was successful or if it failed. That's a red flag. Clinical trials should not have any additional cost to you. You shouldn't have to pay to participate in a clinical trial. Sometimes some of the care that's involved in the trial will be billed to your insurer. And you may have a copay for that aspect of the care. That's something that is, the 20 or some years ago, they didn't do that, but now they do it more than they used to. So it won't necessarily be absolutely free, because they may bill some of the ordinary things they would do for you to your insurance company.
So I just want to look at one, just give a little bit of context real quick. This is all everything that's been said in the past couple of minutes has been in the context of, I go into an office to talk about a clinical trial, and I'm being given information about what the trial is going to consist of, and this sort of information about insurance and payments, and that those elements will probably be brought up in the informed consent potentially, and they should certainly be parts of the conversation, even if they're not written down in a formal way. Is that right? That's where we're at right now?
So you should ask, will there be any cost to me? And the answer should either be no, or it will be no more than what you would pay to see me normally. So, those are the big red flags. What else, Mark?
So whenever I go back to see my mom in this little town of Missouri, right at our exit, there is a sign outside this little storefront saying, come in and participate in our you name the disease research. That is not funny to me, but kind of funny. And I think that you have to use common sense about charlatans and their willingness to make a buck off of your desperation. The worst would be the people that advertise stem cell for cash. Come in and we'll remove some sort of fluid from your cerebral spinal fluid, and we'll send you away for a day, and we may do something. We're going to tell you we're going to do something with this fluid, and tomorrow you can come back in and we're going to give it back to you, but you have to pay $20,000 first. And Parkinson's disease is a disease that is associated with hope, and hope brings increased dopamine. And so if you believe you're going to get better from this stem cell thing that I described, you're going to get better for about 4 weeks, because you're going to secrete more dopamine in your brain, because that's the way the brain works. And so if you decide to tell people you're a whole lot better in 4 weeks after this intervention, more people are going to go to get that intervention. So as a community, you need to make sure everybody is making sound decisions. And I think that's what Davis Phinney and other foundations are really helpful around, to vet things and to provide reliable answers to people who have every right to have the hope and ask, is this something that is real? Is this going to be good for me? But seeking qualified, independent answers about some of these things is important.
But some things that are not red flags are there are a lot of we have gotten a lot of new knowledge about how the brain works. And so lots of people may not have heard about a mechanism of action or a particular intervention. There are very few people who I'm aware of who, if they said the pathway to a better life in Parkinson's is only going to be along this channel, there are very few people I would listen to who said that. There are so many new insights coming out. I have been surprised. There's a trial that was run in the UK using a diabetes drug called exenatide. And I don't know if it's going to work. But when I first heard about this trial, I thought, what's going on here? You know, that's not a mechanism I'm familiar with. And when the first results came back from the study of exenatide, it was surprising. It had some promise. It's pointed us in directions that now my team is going through is on their second trial that is inspired by the insights we've gotten from exenatide research.
So if you wanted to, just one more thing, sorry. If you want to have one question you want to ask anybody who's trying to enroll you in a trial, ask them, is this a phase 2 or phase 3 trial? If they don't know the answer to that, I would be hesitant to move forward. But if it's a phase
unless it's observational.
It's a phase 2 trial, you need to know that that's going to be more safety oriented. And phase 3 trial, we kind of know this is a really safe drug and it's going to be more efficacy oriented. But if your investigator doesn't know if it's a phase 2 or phase 3 trial, or if he or she responds that it is neither, this is an early phase trial, I would be leery of that.
So with the phase 2 trial, another thing you'll find is that in a phase 2 trial, there may be more tests. There may be more blood tests or testing done, a skin punch these days we're looking at. You may see more of that in a phase 2, whereas a phase 3, the FDA really wants to have patient input. You know, they need to have a response from the patient, this made me feel better, to give approval. And so there'll be much more focus on your experience.
There's a couple of things that have come up in the past couple of minutes of this conversation that are interesting to me, and they're sort of on different ends of the conversation. But one of the things I wanted to think about was, Pete, you mentioned the diversity of sort of methods of action, and the way that sometimes these things are surprising. But that called to my mind the difficulty in recruiting people to clinical trials and the challenges that result from not having a diversity of patient participation, not only in terms of racial or ethnic or sex and gender, but also in terms of location. And so these are really complicated issues to address. How can we involve more people in clinical trials? But I'm wondering if you have any perspective about that, not only do we need to look at different methods of action, but we also need to include a broader range of people, a broader scope of participants. So do you have any thoughts about that? Is that right to think that that's necessary?
I think diversity is crucial in clinical trials. I think that it's really important that we get the genetic diversity of humanity in our trials so that we can understand what a drug means to a human as opposed to a small family of humans. So it's really important that we do put a strong effort into getting people who represent the full spectrum of the human experience, and genes are just part of it. Diet, activity levels, all of these things are going to go into understanding the effect of a drug across the spectrum of people who might be asked to, who might be offered it by their clinician once it's approved.
Is there anything else that's coming up that you're excited to learn more about?
So I'll give a philosophical answer and I'll let Pete give specifics. It works better that way. But I've been in Parkinson's disease clinical trial work since 1990. And we've played around one synapse. It is the nigrostriatal dopaminergic synapse. And we have beat that synapse to death, in my opinion. And we've never really found anything that has made a bigger difference than levodopa in 1975. And so we need to go back and think about mechanisms of how symptoms develop. And when you treat somebody with Parkinson's disease, when I look at you in my clinic, if you don't have any rigidity or stiffness when I move your arms, that means at that moment you don't need any more anti-Parkinson's medicine. But if you have more rigidity, then I can increase your medicines. I'd like to find something that would reduce rigidity that is outside of the dopaminergic synapse. So if I could give you a drug that reduces the rigidity by directly acting on your muscle, you're going to move better. And so we need to start being more imaginative about clinical targets. Pete mentioned a diabetes drug earlier. I was very glad he mentioned that because when I was editing for the Journal of Clinical Neuroscience, we got this very strange, odd publication in, or submission in, looking at that drug. And it wasn't, because of funding, it wasn't the best designed trial in the world, but it had some signal. And so we took a risk on that drug. I actually published an editorial about the paper. And I'm pleased to see that it's continued to grow and given other people more ideas about how we can look at the pathogenesis and the symptoms of Parkinson's differently.
So I think that this is a very exciting time in Parkinson's research. When I started working in this field, there were so many trials where I said, they're going to try that again? And now that's very uncommon. Now we see a whole bunch of new ideas coming out, a whole bunch of differences as we've zoomed out, as Mark says, from that tiny, tiny synapse, the tiny, tiny balls of fat encased chemicals in that tiny, tiny space, and thought, what does the larger environment afford us? But one of the challenges that we're seeing is we're getting better insight into how there's a difference between how the disease starts and how it progresses. And there are different ways that we target how the disease starts and how the disease progresses. And there was a time when I was worried that that we would have the polio problem. And when we talk about polio, we think about Jonas Salk and the Salk vaccine and how that eliminated polio. But everybody who had polio before the Salk vaccine, we stopped researching treatments for them. We stopped really working on them. Once we got the polio vaccine, we left that group behind. And what I'm seeing today, and in my portfolio now, I have a Parkinson study on measurement and observational study. I have a Parkinson study on an early intervention to stop how the disease starts. And we have a trial to modify symptoms in people who have the disease. So we're not going to, I don't see a lot of evidence that we're going to forget the people living with the disease today as we focus on stopping the people who will have it tomorrow.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Parkinson's Podcast. For more information about the Davis Phinney Foundation and to learn about educational offerings and community events for people affected by Parkinson's, please visit davisphinneyfoundation.org or dpf.org. This podcast includes information about Parkinson's and insights from our Parkinson's community. It is not intended as a substitute for treatment advice from your own medical providers.